Good evening. At 4 a.m. on January 6, 1919, Theodore Roosevelt took his last breath. He was 60 years old. Archie Roosevelt, his youngest living son, was in New York when his father died, and he telegraphed to his brothers in Europe, "The old lion is dead." Roosevelt's death came as a shock. Vice President Thomas Marshall said, "Death had to take him in his sleep, for if Roosevelt had been awake, there would have been a fight." People celebrate presidential births for a reason. Eulogies and memorials can be a little grim. Birthdays, on the other hand, are fun affairs. But nothing can tell you more about a life lived than reflection. And so tonight, we aim to bring you back to the time of Roosevelt's death and the days following his death, to give you a sense of what the world felt after hearing the news. How would we remember Roosevelt? Well, political allies were the first to pay tribute. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge gave the official state eulogy in Congress. Now, Lodge and Roosevelt had a friendship that predated his rise to high office, and despite differences in 1912, they maintained a close relationship. Lodge spoke to Congress for over an hour, and after the pleasantries and acknowledgments, he said,
"We cannot approach Theodore Roosevelt along the beaten paths of eulogy or satisfy ourselves with empty civilities of commonplace funeral tributes. For he did not make his life journey over main travel roads, nor was he ever commonplace." When the future historian traces Theodore Roosevelt's extraordinary career, he will find embodied ideals planted like milestones along the road over which he marched. They never left him. His ideal of public service was to be found in his life, and as his life drew to a close, he had to meet the ideal of sacrifice, face to face. All his sons went from him to war, and one was killed upon the field of honor. Of all the ideals that lift men up, the hardest to fulfill is sacrifice. Theodore Roosevelt met it as he had met all others, and fulfilled it to the last jot of its terrible demands. His country asked the sacrifice, and he gave it with solemn pride and uncomplaining lips. This is not the place to speak of his private life, but within that sacred circle no man was ever more blessed in the utter devotion of a noble wife and passionate love of his children. The absolute purity and beauty of his family life tell us why the pride and interest of his fellow countrymen felt in him were always touched with the warm light of love. In the home he loved so dear to him, in his sleep, death came, and so valiant for truth passed over, and all the trumpets sounded for him on the other side.
Lodge's heartfelt speech lasted for over an hour, and he tried to fit in all the sides of the many-sided friend. Former Secretary of State Elihu Root took a different approach and offered a short, pithy, and equally heartfelt encomium. Root was a corporate lawyer, but you wouldn't think it from his eloquence. He served as Secretary of War and Secretary of State in Roosevelt's cabinet, and his foreign policies have influenced a century of diplomats. Like Lodge, Root and Roosevelt had a political falling out in 1912, but they maintained their personal friendship.
Wherever in this world Theodore Roosevelt went, his tremendous personal power diffused an atmosphere within which all the men and women there grouped about his central figure, and that spot of earth seemed not foreign, but home for him. He scorned the meretricious and the decadent. He loved nature, its beauty and its grandeur, from the great spaces of plains and mountains to the birds singing in the thicket. And he loved it with affectionate companionship, striving for definite knowledge and understanding. He had a genius for friendship and unfailing sympathy with his fellows, real interest in their lives and fortunes, tender considerations of their shortcomings, pride in their successes. He combined the highest degree of loyalty to his own convictions and confidence in his own powers with an entire absence of self-conceit. He had no petty pride of opinion. He gave freely of his own thought to others, and he eagerly sought and availed himself of all the wisdom of others' experience and knowledge. He was the most advisable man I ever knew, and the most independent and fearless in acting upon his own final conclusions. He was great-hearted, giving bounteously credit and praise to others. He had the saving grace of abundant and ever-present humor. He had purity of character, which kept his mind and heart open to all good influences. He had manifest sincerity of purpose that disarmed suspicion. He was incapable of deception and thoughtless of it. He had the gift of social inspiration, and he had charm. It is too early to estimate the value of his work. We were all too much affected individually in one way or another by what he did to leave it possible that we could have the detachment necessary to impartial judgment. The events which are now occurring in the world, however, cast a light backward upon what he did and emphasize, if they do not measure, its value.
Even some of his critics paid him tribute. William Jennings Bryan, a Democratic contender for president in 1896, 1900, and 1908, toasted Roosevelt's achievements with only passing mention of the many disagreements they had.
The rare qualities that had won for Colonel Roosevelt a multitude of devoted followers naturally arrayed against him a host of opponents. But his death puts an end to that controversy, and he will be mourned by foe as well as by friend. He was a great American, and he made a profound impression on the thought of his generation. His picturesque career will form a fascinating chapter in our nation's history.
Now, the public at large mourned Theodore Roosevelt's loss, but perhaps the deepest grief was known by his family. Each expressed their grief in their own way, some in family letters, and Carine Roosevelt Robinson in this poem, titled simply, "To My Brother."
To my brother, I loved you for your loving ways, the ways that many did not know, although my heart would beat and glow when nations crowned you with their bays. I loved you for the tender hand that held my own so close and warm. I loved you for the winning charm that brought gay sunshine to the land. I loved you for the heart that knew the need of every little child. I loved you when you turned and smiled. It was as though a fresh wind blew. I loved you for your loving ways, the look that leapt to meet my eye, the ever-ready sympathy, the generous ardor of your praise. I loved you for the buoyant fun that made perpetual holiday for all who ever crossed your way, the highest or the humblest one. I loved you for the radiant zest, the thrill and glamour that you gave to each glad hour that we could save and garner from time's grim behest. I loved you for your loving ways, and just because I loved them so, and now have lost them, thus I know I must go softly all my days.
And Roosevelt said this to the 1,000 folks who had gathered to listen to him. If there could be any monument which would appeal to any man, surely this is it. You could not have done anything which would have pleased and touched me more than to name this great dam, this reservoir site after me. And I thank you from my heart for having done so. But you might be surprised to know what in his more somber moments Roosevelt thought about his place in history. North Dakota Governor Lewis Hanna wrote to him in 1910 proposing that this state erect a statue in honor of Roosevelt, who spent those 4 years here as a cowboy and rancher in the 1880s. And Roosevelt replied, "My firm belief," he said, "no, build a statue to pioneers instead." He said, "My firm belief that no man should ever have a statue until he has been dead some little time." But it gets even more interesting. He said in a letter to Oliver Wendell Holmes, in which he invoked the poem, the sonnet by Shelley Ozymandias. He said, "It makes small odds to any of us after we are dead whether the next generation forgets us or whether a number of generations pass before our memory, steadily growing more and more dim, at last fades into nothing. On this point, it seems to me that the only important thing is to be able to feel when our time comes to go out into the blackness, that those survivors who care for us and to whom it will be a pleasure to think well of us when we are gone shall have that pleasure." And then this to a man named Holbrook Curtis, who had endowed a special hospital. And Roosevelt praised him for this. This was 1916, just 3 years before his death. And he said this, and listen to his sense of himself. "There are very, very few men in a generation who have the character or widespread reputation which makes a monument to them symbolize all those things. As for the rest of us, with our failures and shortcomings, but according to our lights, have striven to lead decent lives, if any friends of ours wish to commemorate us after death, the way to do it is by some expression of good deeds to those who are still living. Surely a dead man or woman who was a good man or woman would wish to feel that his or her taking away had become an occasion for real service for the betterment of humankind, rather than to feel that a meaningless pile of stones somewhere, no matter how beautiful, had been erected with his or her name upon it, in an endeavor crowded with similar piles of stone, for such a tomb or mausoleum often bears a chief reference not to the worth, but to the wealth of the one who is dead." He spoke of oblivion, and he said this about his Darwinian notion of history. "Nature is ruthless, and where her sway is uncontested, there is no peace save the peace of death, and the fecund stream of life, especially the life on the lower levels, flows like an immense torrent out of non-existent for but a brief moment before the enormous majority of our beings composed in it are engulfed in the jaws of death and again go out into the shadow and their well-deserved oblivion." That doesn't sound like the Theodore Roosevelt of that cartoon, replacing George Washington as first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. So Roosevelt is always a more complicated being than we can ever understand.
Well, not all of the reflections were positive, not even Roosevelt's. His fiercer critics did not hold back. H.L. Mencken, America's most scathing and polemic critic, used his editorial power and prowess to condemn Roosevelt and those writing hagiographies. He detested the gushing admiration and obedient worship of American presidents passed on.
American sentimentality holds that it is indecent to inquire into the weaknesses of the dead, at least until all the flowers have withered on their tombs. All of Theodore Roosevelt's gabble about the square deal was merely so much protective coloration, easily explicable on elementary Freudian grounds. No man facing Roosevelt in the heat of controversy ever actually got a square deal. He took extravagant advantages. He played to the worst idiocies of the mob. He hit below the belt almost habitually. One never thinks of him as a duelist, say of the school of Disraeli, Palmerston, and to drop a bit, Blaine. One always thinks of him as a glorified longshoreman, engaged eternally in cleaning out barrooms, and not too proud to gouge when the inspiration came to him, or to bite in the clinches, or to oppose the relatively fragile brass knuckles of the code with chair legs, bung starters, cuspidors, demijohns, and ice picks. Roosevelt, a perfectly typical politician devoted to the trade, not primarily because he was gnawed by ideals, but because he frankly enjoyed its rough and tumble encounters and its gaudy rewards, was probably moved in both ways, and also by the hard calculation that I have mentioned. I have a notion that he died too soon. His best days were probably not behind him, but ahead of him. Had he lived 10 years longer, he might have enjoyed a great rehabilitation and exchanged his old false leadership of the inflammatory and fickle mob for sound and true leadership of the civilized minority. For the more one studies his mountebankeries as mob master, the more one is convinced that there was a shrewd man behind the motley, and that his actual beliefs were anything but nonsensical. The truth of them, indeed, emerges more clearly day by day. Roosevelt lived just long enough to see his notions in these directions take on life, but not long enough to see them openly adopted. To the extent of his prevision, he was a genuine leader of the nation, and perhaps in the years to come, when his actual ideas are disentangled from the demagogic fustian in which he had to wrap them, his more honest pronunciamentos will be given canonical honors, and he will be ranked among the prophets.
Well, Mencken was not the only talented writer to eulogize Roosevelt. The poets aimed to canonize him as a national icon. And who more close to Roosevelt's style and strenuosity and imperial contradictions than Rudyard Kipling? The poet wrote an elegiac verse drawn from John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, a religious allegory of righteousness, in which Kipling refers to Roosevelt as Greatheart, Bunyan's heroic character. The poem aimed to make Roosevelt as vital as a biblical character, a moral champion.
Concerning brave captains our age hath made known, for all men to honor, one standeth alone, of whom o'er both oceans both peoples may say, our realm is diminished with Greatheart away. Plain speech with plain folk, and plain words for false things, plain faith in plain dealings, twixt neighbors or kings, he used and he followed, however it spread. Oh, our world is none more honest, now Greatheart is dead. The heat of his spirit struck warm through all lands, for he loved such as showed themselves men of their hands, in love as in hate, paying home to the last. But our world is none the kinder, now Greatheart has passed. Let those who would handle make sure they can wield his far-reaching sword and his close-guarding shield. For those who must journey henceforward alone have need of stout convoy, now Greatheart is gone.
You'd be forgiven if you thought the memorials were an all-male affair, although Mencken has taken a twist tonight, I think. But among Roosevelt's admirers were enthusiastic and organized women, too. Edith Wharton wrote one of the most moving poems of 1919 about Roosevelt, With the Tide. And Edith Roosevelt, TR's wife, and Corrine Roosevelt Robinson, his youngest sister, whose poem we heard earlier, boosted for TR at events around the country. And a group of New York socialites started the first memorial association, the Women's Roosevelt Memorial Association, which met 2 days after Roosevelt died and started making some pretty big plans.
Let's rebuild this house on East 20th Street. Super idea. We could show the very spot where TR defeated asthma and became a man. Oh, he'd love that. A shrine to his childhood.
But didn't Roosevelt disapprove of that when he was alive?
We'll build an auditorium in it and teach everyone about Roosevelt. We'll build a library. We'll gather his old furniture and recreate the very spot he ate dinner and played and stuffed animals.
But isn't there another building there now?
We'll knock it down. We'll knock it down and build a perfect replica. It'll be the greatest landmark in the city.
But won't that be expensive?
We'll raise money throughout the country and bring women together as mothers and teachers.
Better yet, as mothers and teachers, we'll tackle those commies by making Roosevelt's birthplace the foundation for Americanism. We'll stop Americans from radicalism. It's perfect. This house will change the world.
Is that possible?
Yeah.
What about a nice statue in Central Park?
Well, as memorializers turned to talk of tall shafts, buildings, museums, and monuments, Tin Pan Alley and classical composers turned out to write the score of TR's life. Well, along with song, motion pictures, which then were a relatively new medium, Roosevelt understood the value of, would memorialize him as well. 2 weeks after Roosevelt died, the first feature-length film, Our Teddy, was released. Silent, of course, the film took the audience through his upbringing, his presidency, and the family's sacrifice in World War I. TR endorsed the film before his death, and friends who took up the Memorial Crusade in 1919 used the film to build a legacy. Herman Hagedorn, the long-time director of the Men's Roosevelt Memorial Association, came to Medora and the Badlands to conduct interviews with TR's friends and compatriots. The project, many years ahead of its time in terms of technical and production value, shows off the countryside as Roosevelt would know it, and gave the cowboy image that Roosevelt constructed a visual representation. Now, countless actors have played TR on film. He remains a favorite subject for painters, sculptors, and monument makers. Performance art is no less well represented with the likes of James Whitmore performing Theodore Roosevelt in a one-man play, or Joseph Kesselring's Theodore Brewster on stage in Arsenic and Old Lace. Heck, there's even Rose of Elvis. There's something about the stage and performance. It allows audiences to experience history as reenactment, of history as becoming. We might accept that a degree of fiction in drama is necessary, but like the reenactment of military battles, live acting produces a familiarity with the past, dispossessed of Hollywood special effects.
I want us to cheer up. All this grief and mourning, everyone dressed. You know, Mark Twain, no friend of mine, a silly sort of pacifistic satirist, was rumored to have died, and he was still very much alive, and he issued the following statement: "Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated." Well, that's how I feel. All this talk about gloom and memory and historical oblivion. I will be alive as long as freedom and Americanism are prized in this world. Now, I want to say that I am so delighted to be back in Dakota Territory. I came here in 1883 to kill a buffalo, and you, I know all of the rest of it. But I came also to Dickinson for the 4th of July celebration in 1886, at a time when Dickinson had 300 or 400 residents. And in that speech, I said, like all Americans, I like big things. Big prairies and forests and mountains, big wheat fields and railroads and herds of cattle too. And factories and steamboats and everything else. But with the bigness of this country, the great rivers of the West, the Grand Tetons, Yosemite and Yellowstone, with the bigness of the West comes a responsibility. We must form the greatest civilization in history and make our culture as big as the majesty of the Western Plains. And so my challenge is to you not to look to the past with gloom, but to look to the future with a sense of purpose. Now, I have been listening to the discourse for the past couple of days at this conference, and I'm a little disappointed. All that talk of the Great War, it wasn't my war. I had been out of office for a number of years by the time that Woodrow Wilson finally had the moral courage to fight the Hun. I had nothing to do with it. I left office in March of 1909. And for you to spend about a quarter of your time talking about that, I would have done it so much better. Wilson had no foreign experience. He freely admitted that. You know, the longest trip he had made abroad before he became the President of the United States was a bicycle tour of Scotland. How pathetic is that? He was a professor, an intellectual, an abstract idealist, and there is very little room for abstraction in practical government. When the war was finally declared, in my opinion, it was a little bit too late. We needed to get in sooner if we wanted to help determine the post-war settlement of Europe. But when we finally got in, after all of that, I humbled myself and went to see him. Now, I had been pretty hard on him in editorial comments and so on. And I walked into the office. Imagine a former president having to come and hat in hand to sit in front of this Byzantine logothete. And I said to him, all of that is like dust on a windy street. Bygones are bygones. Now I'm asking you, let me gather one more group of harem-scarum cowboys and Indians, another group of Rough Riders, and take it to France. I'm perfectly willing to die there if necessary. Clemenceau has actually asked for me to come. And if I go, it might not change the battles and the artillery and all of the other things, but it will change opinion and it will stir up the courage of the French. We will see that we can provide this sort of American intervention at key times, and it will, of course, galvanize the American people. 100,000 people would follow me if I asked them to. Well, Wilson was a little man, a petty man. And he said, Theodore, thank you very much for your kind offer, but war has changed since your time in Cuba, and there really is no place for a volunteer cavalry in a world war of this sort. It broke my heart. I was perfectly happy to die in the fields of France. Almost eager in a certain sense, because you want the measure of your life to be something of the heroic. All great nations have been fighting nations, and all great individuals have a little of the wolf in them. So at any rate, in your discourse, you hardly mentioned conservation at all. I resent that. I did more than any other president to preserve the landscapes of the American West. I set aside altogether 230 million acres of the public domain as national park, national monument, national forest, national game preserve, and national wildlife refuge. No other president did that. It was hardly mentioned. If you're talking about legacy and impact on the history of this country, why talk about Wilson's war? when you could talk about making sure that we had a preservation of the most extraordinary places in the West, like Devil's Tower and Yellowstone, but also conservation, sustained, scientific, wise use of the great mass of our resources. That's a legacy. And by the way, when I made a list of the things that I had accomplished as president, the two at the top were the Panama Canal, of course, but also the Reclamation Act, which I saw as a conservation measure. You have one, by the way, in the lower Yellowstone up near Sidney, Montana, and Williston, where we irrigate. We make the desert bloom in places that otherwise couldn't support homesteaders or crops. So those were my number two largest achievements that I felt I had accomplished for this country. But here's another one: America's place in the world. We were now the largest economy in the world. We had watched Britain sort of create the Industrial Revolution, but we had applied it in exaggerated terms here. We produced more steel, more coal, more gold, more petroleum. And we needed to realize that the United States was no longer Jefferson's America. You know, the founding fathers believed that the Atlantic Ocean was a 3,000-mile moat between us and the old world. But that moat had narrowed because of steam and the telegraph and the rise of cheap publication by way of new printing presses. And all the other technologies were shrinking the world. And the United States could no longer, given our strength, our resources, our human potential, we could no longer step back and just watch the rest of the world unfold. We needed to take our place in the arena. And somebody had to make this happen. And I did it as president. The country wasn't actually ready for it, but I brought us along. I did it in several ways. I intervened in the Russo-Japanese War and settled it, and for that won the Nobel Peace Prize, the first president to be awarded that. But I also sent the Great White Fleet on a round-the-world cruise in 1907, 1908, and 1909. I built the Panama Canal. These things announced to the world that the United States was no longer an agrarian republic minding its own business, but we had arrived, and we meant to assert ourselves and to help control the destiny of nations. And by the way, at the time that this was occurring, the British Empire was beginning its long, slow fading away, and I knew that nature abhorred a vacuum, that vacuum would be filled, and the only nation that was fit to fill it was the Anglo-Saxon people of the United States. And so I helped to accomplish that. And our Constitution was developed by men like Jefferson and Washington and Franklin and so on, Madison, of course, the father of the Constitution. They deserve our respect and praise. But they lived in a world so different it was almost a foreign nation. They lived in a 3-mile-per-hour world. Nothing much mattered. And so they could be people who wanted very limited government and states' rights and so on. That world has passed. And so we need now a constitution and a government that can do the things that a great nation has to do. And if the Constitution gets in the way of that, then we either have to amend that instrument or just do what needs to be done and hope that it would be acceptable to the American people. And so I stretched government authority. I became the strongest executive since Abraham Lincoln. And I would have gone further if I could have done. But the Constitution that we inherited from the Founding Fathers was no longer adequate to the needs of this nation. And then there was the question of the rich and the poor. The maldistribution of wealth was beginning to tell on this country. And so I made it an effort to support labor in its movements to be treated with respect. I was the first president ever to intervene in an industrial strike on the side of labor. Because somebody has to stand up to these huge corporations. Nobody could have anticipated that. And the only entity with enough strength is either labor or government. And it turns out that both need to be the counterweight to what I call the malefactors of great wealth. And then finally, there's the question of who's an American. You know, we began as an Anglo-Saxon people with the Pilgrims and the Cavaliers of Virginia, and you know the whole story. Of course, it's one of the main stories of American life. But by the time I became president, we had almost 100 million people, and millions of them were from Eastern Europe and from Southern Italy and from nations that had never had a Magna Carta or a Bill of Rights or a constitution of any sort. Many of them came to this country out of sheer desperation, wanting to get away from famine or absolutism. And they came here without skills, without English. They just turned up because they believed in the great dream of this country. But they weren't equipped. They weren't equipped to really thrive here. And so we needed to reach down to them and to protect the least privileged, the least self-reliant of our new citizens. Now, I do insist that they learn English. I insist that they leave their ethnicity at the port. I don't like hyphenated Americans. When you come here, if you're an Irish American or a Hungarian American or an Italian American or a German American, leave all that at the port and become an American. As long as you are fundamentally and fully American, we have no concern about your place or even race of origin. And so when I came into power, accidentally as it were, in September of 1901, I looked around at this nation and I wondered, what are the great questions that must be addressed? What's unfinished in American life? What's the proper role of the government of this country? And then I worked as hard as I possibly could to make those changes happen under my watch. I didn't achieve everything that I had in mind, but I achieved more, I think, than any other president since Abraham Lincoln. Now, let me close by saying this. Back to the Great War for just a moment. I didn't get to go because Wilson was such a mulish little man. But I said to my sons, you are going to war, you are Roosevelts, and no Roosevelt ducks his national service in a time of crisis. You are all going to war, and because you are privileged, doesn't mean you can hang back with desk jobs somewhere behind the lines. You are getting yourself to the front. If you are called upon to fight, you will, and you mustn't let your superiors try to protect you from mayhem. You're Roosevelts. But that doesn't mean you're better than anybody else, and you will do your duty on behalf of this country in this great crisis. Well, they all went, they were all wounded, they were all bloodied. Archie very seriously. Ted too. But my youngest and favorite child, Quentin, was an aeronaut. He flew airplanes. These were new, and this was the first war in which they had played any significant role. He flew these combat missions over France, and in July, he was struck down. Edith and I were at Sagamore. We were, of course, concerned about all of our children. It was 1918. The war was beginning to wind down. We hoped that all of them would come back safely, but there were rumors that were coming to Sagamore from the Associated Press and other newsmen that something had happened, and we didn't know what it was, but we had hope that Quentin would be fine. And then I remember that moment when a newsman came up and he handed me a telegram. And now I knew for certain that little Quentikins was dead. I excused myself and went into my study. I shut the door. And I was there for about half an hour, alone. And then I came out, and I said to the newsmen and several others who had gathered, I said, now I must go do the most difficult thing that I have ever done. I must go tell his mother. That was the hardest moment of my entire life. And something went out of me, and Edith too, at that moment. But I resolutely said, no man is fit to live who is not willing to die. And so we expressed our restrained pride and the heroism of all of our children, but of course particularly little Quentin. Now let me close by responding to these intellectuals who have been here working over my life and concentrating on things of no importance and missing all of the ones that really matter. By reminding you, of course, of what I said at the Sorbonne in October of 1910. I had been on my year-long safari in Africa, and I had met Edith in the north of the African continent, and we had begun a kind of a grand tour of all of the great capitals of Europe. I got to observe the troops, the Prussian troops with the Kaiser, and I gave lectures at Oxford University, and I took my Nobel Peace Prize and gave the speech. I attended the funeral on behalf of Taft, of the British King Edward VII. But I gave a lecture at the Sorbonne in October of 1910 on citizenship. And in it I said this, and this is what I say to you, sir, and to all the other professors who have come here. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbled or how the doer of deeds could have done them better. No, the credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred with dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes up short again and again, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows the great devotions, the great enthusiasms, and spends himself wholly in a worthy cause. And if he should succeed, knows the triumph of high achievement. But if he should fail, at least fails while daring greatly, and is not to be numbered amongst those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. I repeat, it is not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena. God bless you, citizens. And now, James, please put out the light.